So we live in a Western liberal democracy, and those who live in Western liberal democracies are supposed to be Lockeans by spirit. That is to say, we're supposed to believe that there are certain rights that we have by birth, that those rights include life, liberty, perhaps the pursuit of happiness, or at least the possession of stuff that's ours. That the purpose of the state is to protect those rights. And if the state doesn't protect those rights, we have the right to resist the state. It's something we tell ourselves frequently enough that most actually seem to believe it. But there's everything to suggest that it's a fiction we're telling ourselves. For there's every reason to believe that those living in Western liberal democracies do not, with all due respect to the Declaration of Independence, locate our rights in the laws of nature and of nature's God, but instead think that they're given to us by the state. Leviathan, not nature's God, is God, right? So we talk like Lockeans, but we act like Hobbesians. And if what I've just said is true, it's debatable, right? But if it's true, one of the questions is, how did it come to pass? And there are few people alive better placed to help us think about this than one of the world's leading experts on Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, Dr. Jeffrey Collins. Jeff Collins is an associate professor of history at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard University and served for 3 years as a postdoc at the University of Chicago. He's published lots of articles on early modern religion, politics, and political thought, and he's a regular book reviewer for the Wall Street Journal and the Times Literary Supplement. His first book was called The Allegiance of Thomas Hobbes, and that came out from Oxford in 2005, and he's currently writing a book on early modern religious conflict and the origins of liberal political order today. He visits us tonight as a guest at the George Washington Forum. The Washington Forum doesn't receive federal funding. It doesn't take your student funds. I would note it relies on private donations, and I'm happy to say that tonight's talk is underwritten by generous donations of OU alumni and staff, and by a grant from the Charles Koch Foundation. So I want to thank all of them for helping make this event possible, and I want to ask you to help me join in welcoming Jeff Collins here to Ohio University.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, for the invitation, and for all of you for attending this wonderful forum. And thank you to the students I've met today. They're very impressive students from this fine institution, which I'm visiting for the first time. So my topic for this evening is religious conscience, the freedom of religious conscience, and the freedom of religion and religious practice more generally. This is a broad interest of mine, as Robert suggests, both historically, I've written about this in different contexts, and in terms of contemporary politics. I'll perhaps start by noting that the language we use to describe these phenomena is important. And I think here particularly of the contrast between free conscience on the one hand and freedom of religion or free exercise on the other. Conscience, after all, is at its base an internal thing, a matter of belief. And as many have noted, to have conscience freedom might only mean that one has the right to their own secret, unspoken thoughts. In some sense, that is an important freedom, but it has potentially few or no political implications. Václav Havel, the great dissident, captured this dynamic in his work, The Power of the Powerless, of 1978, where he offered up his famous example of the green grocer, who, though not a communist, dutifully hung a sign outside of his shop every day reading, "Workers of the world unite." Thus, he avoided suspicion and maintained his living in a totalitarian society by conformity. He had his conscience freedom, but his conscience could only survive in silence. In this way, however, we see how minimal free conscience can be and how consistent it can be with a kind of servility. Havel translated the sign in his essay not as "Workers of the world unite," but as, quote, "I am afraid and therefore unquestionably obedient." Now, we of course do not live in a totalitarian society or anything like it, but there are forces in our society and in most societies which encourage outward intellectual conformity, a suppression of disagreement, and thus, for dissidents, a public falsity. A mere freedom of conscience will do little to mitigate such conditions of intellectual captivity. George Orwell described such rote conformism and false agreement as the way that men became machines. And something like this is implied by the famous saying, quote, "All tyranny needs to gain a foothold is for people of good conscience to remain silent." This phrase is sometimes attributed to Jefferson and sometimes to Burke, but seems to have been said by neither of them, actually. John Stuart Mill said something similar in the middle of the 18th century. This is as close as I can come to attributing it. Free conscience, in short, however grand the phrase, doesn't on its own get us very far towards a society of freedom. The phrase freedom of religion or of religious exercise suggests considerably more, but it only suggests it. One might, after all, define the freedom of religion or the freedom of religious exercise as a freedom of inner belief. So we're right back where we started. But most of us mean something more by the phrase freedom of religion. It might, however, be a freedom limited to particular institutions and particular practices, the freedom to worship, if you will. It might, on the other hand, imply a freedom to worship, but also a freedom to act in public in ways consistent with one's religious convictions, in economic life, in political life, in associational life. Almost all liberal societies have at least enshrined the former understanding of religious freedom, the freedom to worship, in a voluntary space as a religious association with minimal or no interference from the state. Such a freedom entails a freedom to associate with like-minded co-religionists, to organize services, to espouse doctrine. This is still, however, a fairly narrowly defined understanding of freedom of religion, perhaps better thought of as freedom of worship. And even it is not necessarily sacrosanct everywhere. And a lot of the fights we have about religious freedom are about the limitations of public activity that are justified based on the notion of religious freedom. In England, for instance, and elsewhere, there have been proposals to use non-discrimination laws to force religious institutions to integrate their clergy on gender lines. In the United States, there have been fights, particularly under the Obama administration, to strictly limit or even eliminate the so-called ministerial exception, which frees religious employers from general non-discrimination laws. They actually lost the test case on that in 2012, 9-0 before the Supreme Court. But the point is, in general, that through employment law, public accommodation laws, and regulations surrounding the tax code, even the freedom of worship, which is widely recognized, can also be infringed. It's worth noting in this regard that there was concern in some circles when President Obama and his administration began in court filings to refer to the freedom of worship rather than the freedom of religion, which was the traditional phrase used in American jurisprudence, the freedom of religion. The freedom of worship seemed to some to indicate something somewhat narrower. But in any case, even where it is robustly protected, freedom of worship does not necessarily encompass a broader freedom of religion to act and live publicly outside of places of worship in ways consistent with one's religious views. And most of our current conflicts over religious liberty today involve that broader question. How fully does my freedom of religion allow me or you to live in a way consistent with my or your beliefs? Now here the potential for religious liberty to infringe or discomfit or irritate other citizens is obviously greater. And the questions become: what level of infringement is acceptable? How do we define harm to others? And these are deeply contested questions in our politics. In 1993, the federal government passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed virtually unanimously by the US Senate, was proposed by Ted Kennedy, was signed by President Clinton. And this act took a fairly generous view of religious freedom as it might inform non-worship practices. So the law noted that neutrally applied laws, general laws, could violate religious freedom, and that the state should not burden religious freedom unless, one, there was a compelling government interest at stake, and two, most importantly, there was no more accommodating way of achieving that interest. So this law set up strict scrutiny for even neutral laws that violated religious freedom. One example is the incident that actually provoked the law, which was the use of peyote in certain indigenous American religious ceremonies, which was against the drug laws at the time. So a lot of recent battles over religious freedom in America concern the application of this kind of generous reading, and laws like this are very rare in the Western world, actually. Recent cases in point include the battle between the administration and the Obama administration and religious groups and private enterprises as to whether religious freedom is infringed if employers are forced to cover birth control or abortion in their insurance plans. Another case that I'm sure you've read about that's due to hit the Supreme Court this year would be the question of bakers, photographers, and other creative artists, so described, who wish to refrain from participating in same-sex weddings. The question in these cases is whether religious freedom, understood outside of the worship space and the confines of the clergy, demands some relaxation of neutral laws and regulations. As I say, in the United States is unusually generous among Western liberal democracies on this question. I say has been because the consensus may be fraying somewhat. When we look to the foundational constitutional laws of the United States and our peer countries, we see differences in the way that religious freedom is described. The language of the US Constitution on the question is, of course, contained in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. A few things, that's not the entirety of the First Amendment, but that's the relevant Establishment Clause. A few things to note here. The Establishment Clause is double-sided. It doesn't just prohibit a national church establishment with coercive penal laws like the old Church of England in colonial times. It also prevents hindrance to the free exercise of religion. Not just conscience, but religion, and not just worship, but not just conscience, but exercise, and not just worship, but religion more broadly. These are distinct in the amendment. Other rights follow in the First Amendment, of course, free speech, press, assembly. These are distinct, but their proximity to the first freedom, as it's sometimes known, the freedom of religion, is perhaps telling, and implies that a robust political, public freedom of religion might entail other rights, rights of assembly, rights of free speech, if you will. So I think it's thus fair to suggest that a robust freedom of religion, liberating but also enabling religious practice, lies at the very heart of the most crucial freedoms of the Bill of Rights. The US Constitution, however, is unusual on this question. The English Bill of Rights of 1689, for instance, ensured free speech, but it did not include a right to religious freedom. And indeed, its language at various points upheld the special status of Protestantism and the established Church of England. Even the English Toleration Act of 1689 did not disestablish the church and only permitted free worship with very strict limitations. It did not open civil liberties up to dissenters. Religious dissenters were kept out of Parliament, out of the universities, and so forth. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in the country I now teach in, passed only in 1982, it's a much more recent document, designates as one of its 4 fundamental freedoms, quote, freedom of conscience and religion. So there's a distinction in the document between conscience and religion, and also a distinction between conscience and religion on the one hand, and freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression on the other. So Canada seems to acknowledge more than a mere freedom of conscience in this document. The European Convention on Human Rights has an article, Article 9, which concerns freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. I want you to think about these words. It avows, 1, that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, distinctly enumerated, that this right includes the freedom to change one's religion or beliefs with freedom, and the freedom also, either alone or in community with others, either in public or private, these are expressly designated, to manifest one's religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. The second clause, however, establishes that the freedom to manifest one's religion or belief shall be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of public safety, the protection of public order, health, the protection of rights and freedoms, or morals. So a fairly extensive realm. So here, religious practice, this is in the European Convention, religious practice and observance is thickly described as much more than a freedom of conscience or mere private worship freedom, but the second proviso does envision a wide variety of considerations that might limit it. And I think most striking is this notion of morals potentially limiting religious freedom. On the least generous side of the scale among liberal democracies, we must point to France. The Declaration of the Rights of Man of 1789 reads of religion, quote, "No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his or her religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law." This is surely the most terse, ungenerous, and ambiguous expression of a right to religious freedom, which is qualified by a deference to all law and speaks of religious views or opinions in a way that might suggest a mere conscience freedom. There's really no explicit defense of free exercise at all here. And it's perhaps not surprising that in France, and indeed in Quebec, the old French colony, the principle of pluralism and state neutrality is weaker, I think, than in Anglophone countries. The notion of laicism or secularism in France is very powerful and can lead to a kind of positive principle of secularism in French society. An example being the recent laws or proposals in both France and Quebec banning conspicuous religious symbols from certain public spaces. This largely targeted Muslim body coverings, but also forbade large crosses and so forth. Quebec's version of this has died, but was known as the Charter of Secular Values, which gives you a bit about what was envisioned. Likewise, the Constitution of the Fifth Republic in France, which dates to 1958, there's always a constitution every few decades in France, so this one's from 1958 and is the one currently in force, invokes the rights of man in its preamble, but also declares French secular. Secularity works as a kind of positive principle or public ideology which makes the public space less neutral, less pluralistic, and more readily hostile to public shows of religion. The word religion appears only once in the French Constitution. The word opinion appears 19 times. A lot could be said on these points. I'm not a legal scholar nor an expert in modern constitutional law. My point is merely to delineate the broad shape of the debate as it now plays out and to point to some of the key distinctions that we often run together: conscience freedom, freedom of worship, and religious freedom. Three distinct ideas. We tend to think of Western liberalism having a single doctrine on this subject or a single tradition, but it does not. France is on one end, I would say, and the United States on the other, of a broad spectrum of opinion on this question. And this results in very different judgments about questions like what religious expression or religious dress or religious architecture or noise or processions are acceptable and which are not, based upon varying conceptions of the public good, of order, of the rights of others. Another important distinction, perhaps even more critical, is where any of these freedoms come from. What is their source? How foundational are they? Can protection of them justify, in the extremity, resistance to the state? This is a question I'm going to focus on for the remainder of my talk, in part by bringing some intellectual history to bear on the question. So there are two questions before us. What is the extent of our religious freedom in the United States, and where does it come from? How is it protected? Excuse me. The history of religious freedom can be approached from any number of perspectives. Social history offers us one angle of vision on the subject. I'm not going to take that approach today, but if we were to look, say, at European society in the 17th and 18th centuries, we would find some very familiar debates and strategies of coexistence. As more pluralistic parts of Europe, such as the Netherlands and England and some of the German states, grappled with religious difference, they debated subjects that we debate today. Should a minority religion be permitted to ring bells in a town? Could they have markers on their churches, or should the churches be disguised to look like nondescript buildings? Could they process through the streets with religious symbols? Could they have their own family law and family courts, or orphanages and welfare provisions? Often the answer to these questions was no, leading to the provision of some amount of religious freedom, but restricting access to the public space, to politics, to the universities, and so forth. In other words, there were, in the early modern world, various methods of hiding disagreement between a facade of agreement or concord. In the face of moral and religious disagreement, compromises were made that might look to us somewhat familiar, allowing freedom of worship, but impinging freedom of religion in a broader sense. So we are the sons and daughters of the early modern world on this question, even if our dominant religion is not an established church, but a hegemonic liberalism. But I'm not going to say more about social history, the practice of coexistence, the lived experience of freedom of religion in the early modern world. Instead, I'm going to talk about intellectual history, where our ideas of religious freedom come from in the English-speaking world, what their extent is, and how they're defended according to these conceptions. And I'm going to talk about two men who are on the Mount Rushmore of Western theoretical tradition, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. These two men and their reception through the centuries have set up what I think of as the two paths of modern liberalism, particularly on the question of religious liberty. And the question of religious freedom is paramount in the liberal tradition and its historical self-understanding. Now, by liberal, of course, I do not mean the left liberalism of American politics. I mean the classic liberalism of Locke, Constant, Mill, Rawls, a broad tradition that sees the individual and his or her freedom as the atom of politics. So liberalism is a politics based on individual equality of some kind, on the denial of natural hierarchy. Liberalism organizes politics around the surrender of individual rights to a sovereign. So individuals surrender some of their rights, or all of them, to a sovereign for the protection of their more basic rights, or more important rights. Liberalism sometimes posits a state of nature and a theory of social contract to describe this process. So artificial sovereignty, no natural hierarchy, no natural aristocracy or monarchy, individualism, natural equality of some kind, and the surrender of some rights for the protection of others. These are the fundaments of the liberalism I'm talking about here. The sovereign in a liberal system is not a party to the social contract. The sovereign is created by the social contract. And the sovereign can be resisted whenever it fails to protect those rights that it was designed to protect according to the system. So in theory, liberalism contains a notion of consent, of representation, and the possibility of resistance, which is something we like to forget about a lot, I think, in modern politics. Where does this tradition come from? Well, liberalism, or liberal politics, or liberal policies, at best date, those phrases at best date from the late 18th century and the early 19th century, more likely. So the name liberalism is a name tradition only fairly recently. But 20th century theories of liberalism go back further. They go back into the 17th century and trace the prehistory of liberalism back to the early modern world. And two figures stand out above all others from that time, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Hobbes was born in 1588, the year of the Spanish Armada. He used to say that his mother had gone into labor out of fear of the Spanish. So he said, "I was born the twin of fear." 1588, Locke died in 1704. So the span is 116 years of these two men. Amazingly, they were contemporaries for 47 years of those 116 years. They both lived through the awful civil wars of Britain and the execution of Charles I in 1649, and then the restoration of the Stuart dynasty in 1660. Hobbes nearly witnessed, and Locke did witness, the glorious revolution of 1688, when the Catholic son of Charles I, James II, was overthrown and a new, more constitutional monarchy was established in England under William and Mary. The political theories of Locke and Hobbes spoke to this period of crisis. They wrote a lot, but Hobbes' most famous work was his Leviathan of 1651, written not long after the execution of Charles I. Locke's was the Two Treatises of Government, written in the run-up to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and published immediately after it. Both Hobbes and Locke adopt these devices I just described, the state of nature, natural rights, natural equality, the social contract, to formulate new theories of sovereignty in the face of this crisis. They represent, these two figures, the coming of the age of sovereignty, replacing the older view that monarchy and aristocracy were natural forms of power. As most of you will know, Hobbes' version of this political theory was very harsh. For Hobbes, politics was about protecting us from violence and death, avoiding civil war, or the natural war of all against all, as he put it. To achieve this, individuals surrender virtually all of their natural rights to the sovereign, and only preserve the right to protect their own life. That was the fundamental reason for politics, so that you could never surrender, the right to protect your own life. But otherwise, all of your rights were surrendered, and the sovereign represented you in most every respect, and you had to obey. Locke, his political theory took the same shape, but he softened matters. In nature, according to Locke, humans were less bestial, less violent than Hobbes had suggested, and so sovereigns were thus not created just to protect our lives, but also our property rights, our political rights, our right to labor, and other rights. Obedience to the sovereign was only required when those rights, generally, were being protected. So for Hobbes, only the fear of life for one's life, fear for one's life, could justify resisting the sovereign. The sovereign was otherwise absolute. For Locke, resistance could be justified if other rights were threatened. One might capture this contrast by saying that Hobbes feared chaos more than tyranny, while Locke feared tyranny more than chaos. One can perhaps see why liberals have looked to Hobbes and Locke as the forefathers of social contract liberalism. Locke's system was much more clearly liberal in its outcomes, in its constitutional outcomes. Looks a lot more like the American Constitution, his outcomes. But in Hobbes, even, we get the skeleton of the system. Natural equality of persons, individual interest, contract, the use of rights as a concept. Now, what does all of this have to do with questions of conscience or religious freedom? Well, for a long time in the 20th century, not much. For many decades, histories of liberalism looked to Hobbes and Locke as progenitors, but they tended to focus on the question of property rights. Locke's decision to modify Hobbes and introduce property rights was taken to be the key moment in the history of liberalism. This history of liberalism was often written around the question of what was called possessive individualism. A liberal society in this telling was a capitalist society of property rights and exchange. And the key moment was when folks like Locke asserted natural property rights against the sovereign. So the sovereign had to protect your property. But over the last 3 decades or so, I would suggest that emphasis on property rights has been not replaced, but softened in most historical schemes of liberalism. Today, more historians and theorists would look to conscience rights as the foundational individual rights of the liberal tradition. This, for instance, is the perspective of the most influential liberal theorist of the 20th century, John Rawls. In his lectures on the history of political philosophy, Rawls claimed that liberalism emerged from, quote, the Reformation and religious wars, ending with the principle of toleration and liberty of conscience. For Rawls, the key moment was not property rights, but was when theorists began to reject the supposedly absolutist demands of the medieval Catholic Church and then gave people a natural right to arbitrate their own religious beliefs. This individualism interested Rawls as an individualism of belief, of conscience, the idea that humans decided on their own what they believed. It was freedom of conscience, but also it was a toleration of diverse religious practices, in Rawls's view. And for Rawls, the key text in this tradition was Locke's Letter on Toleration, which appeared in 1689 after the Glorious Revolution. Locke wrote this work in the Dutch Republic and published it anonymously. Many of you will have read it. If you haven't, you should. In this short work, it's short, so if you haven't read it, go read it, Rawls wrote that Locke had asserted natural equality, an individual interest in one's own salvation, and the injustice of coercing the belief of others. And he had also argued for the need to make religious societies purely voluntary, so you could enter them and exit them as you wished. Law could not make you join churches. In other words, the letter made religious belief or conscience one of those individual rights that not only exist, but might be protected by resisting the sovereign. In other words, the right of conscience was not a creation of politics. It was pre-political. And you could use it to resist sovereignty if the sovereign impinged on your right of conscience or your right of religious freedom. And this has been a broadly influential point of view. The history of liberalism since I'd say the 1980s roughly, has been written around this category of religious freedom much more than the category of property rights. We can discuss the reasons why the politics of the late 20th and early 21st century might have pushed us in this direction. Factors might include the fading of Marxism, the surprising revival of religious warfare in the late 20th century, the geopolitical conflict between the West and the Islamic world, and the domestic splits opened up by the American culture wars. It's also true that this emphasis on conscience rights as the seedbed for liberalism makes some intuitive sense. For reasons I suggested at the start of the talk, conscience rights seem to inform, more clearly I think than property rights, a right to free speech, a right to free association. So religious freedom looks fertile, if you will, of other related rights, which is why it's sometimes called the first freedom in the Bill of Rights. And finally, a focus on conscience and religious freedom works better for us because we have, since the Enlightenment really, but particularly in the last 30, 40 years, been obsessed with the notion of religious war and how the modern state has saved us from religious warfare. And it's not property rights, but it's conscience freedom that finally resolves the religious warfare according to our mythologies, according to our historical mythologies. The state protecting our individual rights removes us from the period of religious warfare of the 17th century. So for all these reasons, we can talk more about this, we now, I think, broadly follow Rawls and trace liberalism back to the cause of free religious conscience. But again, that's a fairly recent development within histories of liberalism. Now, Locke's heroic role in this story is not surprising. He, after all, wrote the letter on Toleration, which is probably the most famous defense of religious freedom in the Western canon. But what may surprise you, and surprises me, is that in the last generation there's been a concerted effort to integrate Hobbes into this story of liberal triumph. Many recent theorists and historians have liberalized Hobbes, if you will, by presenting him as an early theorist of conscience and toleration. And for the rest of this talk, I'm going to try to explain this apparent paradox and suggest why this is happening and what it tells us about our current political moment. The new appreciation for Hobbes is, as I say, interesting but surprising. Historians, and I'll name a few, Alan Ryan, Richard Tuck, the late Perez Zagarin, among others, and many theorists as well, now present Hobbes as an important thinker who introduced conscience rights into the liberal tradition. Again, this is a paradox. Leviathan, as I've said, justified an absolute sovereign. The only individual right that survived the creation of sovereignty was the right to protect one's life. And Hobbes was, moreover, very well aware that people acting on their religious conscience could be violent and could trigger civil wars. He made that point repeatedly. However, in Leviathan, after the regicide of Charles I, Hobbes did speak of religious conscience in a surprisingly deferential way. He wrote the book after the king was dead and England was for a brief time a republic. The old established church of bishops had been abolished, a new church had not been successfully erected, and many of Hobbes's countrymen were clamoring for a regime of free, or at least freer, conscience. And among these was John Milton and other famous writers and theorists of the era. Surveying this scene, Hobbes now wrote of the impossibility of coercing individual conscience with violence. Previously, he had just written about free conscience as if it was a dangerous thing, and had urged individuals to conform to public doctrine. Now he changed his tune. Conscience, he argued, was mere opinion. Individuals could not themselves really control or command their opinions, and so to force them or to coerce them was stupid, was folly. So sovereigns, Hobbes argued, should not try to enforce complex orthodoxies. They should allow individuals to have some latitude in expressing their beliefs and in potentially deciding which churches they wanted to belong to. Now, some of this did indeed anticipate John Locke, particularly the argument that inner conscience or opinion cannot be forced. For many liberals today, Hobbes thus deserves some celebration. He was an absolutist, sure, but he did admit that sovereigns could not represent the consciences of their subjects. A sovereign could represent all of your material interests, It could determine all the laws which governed your material interests or your outward behavior, but he could not really logically represent your opinions or your inner beliefs. Thus, Hobbes devised, or so the argument goes, a theory of conscience freedom. It is thus not unusual to find Hobbes celebrated along these lines nowadays, and this is fairly recent, as a thinker who saved us from religious war, introduced the beneficent modern state, and even provided us some conscious freedom. That last bit is the new addition. The intellectual historian Mark Lilla, for instance, has praised Hobbes along these lines. So too, in a more roundabout way, has the well-known historian of the Enlightenment, Jonathan Israel. Perhaps most telling is the sociobiologist Steven Pinker, moonlighting as an historian in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where Hobbes also figures as a kind of hero of the modern state. In all of these works, Hobbes is celebrated for coming up with the particular blend of state power and individual freedom that saved Western civilization from endless religious conflict. And Hobbes, over the last 3 centuries, has begun to take his place alongside Locke as the author of this achievement. Now, to speak frankly, and for myself, this new vogue for Hobbes can only be described as worrying for anyone invested in a robust definition of religious freedom. And this draws me back to the distinction I started with between mere conscience freedom and freedom, religious freedom of a more robust kind. Because what Hobbes offers is mere conscience freedom. The word conscience from Latin means to know with or to know within. And it usually means to know within in the broad Western tradition or the broad Judeo-Christian tradition that Hobbes is grappling with. To know within oneself. To Christians and many others, a right conscience would know truth, either implanted by God or evident in nature, or accessible by reason reflecting the mind of God. The voice of conscience, rightly ordered and not willful, directs one to true beliefs, according to this understanding. But Hobbes defined conscience differently. He defined it as mere private opinion. He used the phrase constantly. This, I think, was maybe the consequential moment in the history of political thought and religious freedom. Not Hobbes' deference to conscience only, but his definition of conscience as pure subjective opinion. Because opinion in Hobbes was arbitrary, was determined by the blind forces of nature. Hobbes was a materialist, as most of you will know. He believed that all that existed was matter in motion. He did not believe in a spiritual soul or a spiritual God or a spiritual mind. And even our beliefs were the product of material processes determined by the collision of atoms. And so what we believe internally, our conscience, does not reveal truth to us. It merely reflects the way our opinions have been driven by material circumstances, by the onslaught of matter in motion. This makes our opinion the creature of our fears and our appetites. This definition of conscience breaks dramatically from the Judeo-Christian tradition. It no longer made sense for Hobbes to speak of a right conscience. You could have a right to conscience, but not a right conscience. That made no sense. It didn't make sense to speak of a wrong conscience or a wrongly ordered conscience. All conscience was mere opinion, and thus the creation of a rational will. Hobbes did not believe in free will. All of our thoughts and actions, he believed, were determined by blind matter. Our opinions of what is right and wrong, just or unjust, godly or sinful, do not reflect truth, but merely our own private opinion of good and evil. The good for the Hobbesian human was merely what one desired. Evil was the deprivation of what one desired. Good and even evil itself, and thus the conscience that identified good and evil, were purely arbitrary acts of appetite. So Hobbes did add the proviso, however, that forcing conscience was folly. A Freudian slip. A sovereign could force behavior, but not belief. The conscience was, in this sense, always free, inside oneself. But this, too, was simply a question of the application of force. The conscience is free like water is free to roll down a hill. It's free as a matter of its material necessity. It doesn't have intention. Sovereigns can force bodies, but they cannot force minds. So free conscience itself was part of the world of material necessity. So Hobbes offered what I would describe as a bare right of free conscience. The right to have your own opinions, your own private, unspoken thoughts. You are the king of the world between your ears. Every man, Hobbes wrote tellingly, has his own private religion. This is the free conscience of Havel's greengrocer. Now, Hobbes did think that a wise sovereign might introduce some actual religious freedoms of practice and speech. He suggested at various times allowing people to join churches of their own choosing, or to speak their mind, or to publish on theological questions. But these were mere counsels of prudence. A wise sovereign might decide to do that in the interest of the stability of his polity, or to prevent rebellions, but he might decide not to do that, or she might decide not to do that. It was a question of prudence and statecraft, of cost and benefit. There were no enforceable exterior religious rights of behavior in Hobbes that might justify resistance to sovereignty. Locke's account of religious freedom is very different. Early on, to be sure, he found Hobbes' system somewhat appealing, and we can talk about this more if you'd like in questions. Locke was early on rather drawn to this system and considered him as, well, I think was something of a Hobbist on religious questions. But in his mature thinking, which produced the letter on toleration and the two treatises on government, he explicitly rejected Hobbism, and the story of Locke's emancipation from Hobbism is the story of the book I've just finished. There were several critical differences from Hobbes and Locke on conscience. First, Locke was not a materialist. He believed in a spiritual soul and a spiritual God. Secondly, Locke believed in free will. He was not a determinist. He did not believe that all things and all thoughts were produced by matter in motion and thus reflected merely primal appetites. Third, Locke asserted belief in natural law, in good and evil that was fundamentally true. Morality was revealed by our natural reason as it interacted with nature and as it reflected divine reason. Finally, Hobbes and Locke had very different theories of equality. They both believed in natural equality, but for Hobbes, the natural equality of humans was the natural equality of animals. In nature, humans could equally well kill each other, is what he said. Which means really that skills and power and smarts and muscle, not that they were distributed evenly among people in the state of nature, but they were distributed indifferently. So there was no order to it or a way you could tell who was better than the other naturally. There's no natural aristocracy of the smart or the strong. This is the equality of brute force and animal nature. Locke's equality was very different. For Locke, humans are spiritually equal, morally equal. Why? Because as a species, they possess a capacity to reason abstractly, and this capacity reflects the mind of God. Now, there's a lot here. Just to reiterate, Hobbes believed that humans were equal materially, bestially, driven by appetite and aversion, and controlled by the blind force of nature. For Locke, humans, if fallen and corrupt, nevertheless have free will, are equal in the image of God, and have reason that can access truth. Conscience to Hobbes is only subjective opinion. Conscience to Locke, much more traditionally, can be a right use of reason to perceive divine or natural truths, actual truths about the world, the physical world, the moral world. For this reason, though he agreed with Hobbes that conscience cannot be forced, Locke's understanding of religious freedom went well beyond this. For Locke, religious freedom required the capacity to school and inform the mind, to hear the truth, to speak it, to evangelize, and to organize for the purpose of moral religious seeking. He thus explicitly defended a freedom of worship, which was, moreover, natural and inherent and pre-political. It could justify, Locke argued, resistance to state power. For Locke, toleration or religious freedom was never the mere gift of sovereignty. It was never just an act of prudence. It was an inherent right, and if the sovereign impinged it, the sovereign could be resisted. In Locke and Hobbes, I would suggest, along these lines, we see the origin of the basic division I spoke of at the start of this talk, of freedom of conscience or opinion versus a freedom of religion or exercise. In the US Constitution, when the Constitution speaks of the state forbidding not just established religions, but hindering the free exercise of religion as well, it speaks the language of Locke and the language of religious freedom. When the French Constitution melts religion into opinion, remember, religion once, opinion 19 times in the French Constitution, it speaks the language of Hobbes and mere free conscience. The former frees inner thought only, the latter frees outer action. The former can be silenced, the latter must speak and motivate action. The Hobbesian conscience is intensely private and subjective. The Lockean conscience is public, requires formation, which requires association, and so on. The Lockean and Hobbesian traditions of thinking on this question reach us by different roads through history. Locke's Toleration, with its much more Christian flavor, became a canonical text in the nonconformist Protestant tradition. Through that mechanism, it heavily influenced 18th century American culture during the colonial period. There's been a long debate about Locke's influence over the American Revolution, but it tends to focus on the two treaties of government. If you look at the letter on toleration, the influence is quite clear. Locke's letter on toleration, in fact, was the first Lockean text that was published in the American colonies on its own, not imported from England. It appeared in 1742 as a publication organized by the graduating class of Yale, 17 men, all of whom became ministers, and who wanted Locke's letter to argue against the restrictive religious settlement of colonial Connecticut. Important ministers and advocates for toleration and religious freedom, such as Elisha Williams, Isaac Foster, Isaac Backus, all appealed to the letter. So Locke's letter on toleration had a very important influence in the run-up to the Revolution, the Constitution, and most importantly, the Bill of Rights, the amendments. Now, Locke was not perfect on this question of religious liberty. He had a Protestant bias against hierarchical corporate churches, so he was not tolerant of Catholicism. We can talk about that, if you'd like, after the talk. But I think in ways more robust than we sometimes recognize, he spoke for an important Christian natural law tradition and helped to preserve some of its influence in the period of the American founding. Hobbes' entry into liberalism is very different. The colonial Americans would not have thought of Hobbes in any way as a theorist of conscience. Hobbes really only becomes liberalized, if you will, in the 19th century among utilitarians. Utilitarians in general in the 19th century, and these include really John Stuart Mill, the great liberal, were materialists, they were atheists, they were determinists, just like Hobbes. So they did not believe in the spiritual realm of free will, and they basically thought of liberty as a kind of fact, as a kind of thing that worked to maximize profit and stability, not as something you had as a natural right. Jeremy Bentham famously called natural rights nonsense upon stilts. So Hobbes appealed to these people, and they begin to present him as a kind of forerunner of their own system of thought. We can get a flavor of this in John Stuart Mill's famous text on liberty, where he writes, "It is proper to state that I forego any advantage which could be derived to my argument for liberty from the idea of abstract right." Locke would have been turning in his grave at this point. "I would regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions." So Hobbesian liberalism and Lockean liberalism have thus traveled two separate roads. One gives us a more absolute statist version of liberalism, whereby our rights are merely offered to us as a matter of prudent statecraft. The other sees our rights and liberty as pre-political and as potential instruments of resistance to the state. And I've suggested that these two visions reflect two very different worldviews about humans, their wills, their souls, and their place in the material world. From these two different worldviews come two different understandings of conscience and religious freedom. And I think the recent enthusiasm for Hobbes tells us something significant, and I think somewhat troubling. For Jonathan Israel, for instance, we can only be free once we understand that we are merely material beings, driven by appetite and interest in a world of blind matter. Illusions about the spiritual realm, God, free will, these merely bind us to authority. So Hobbes and Spinoza in particular, in Israel's case, I won't get into that, but gave liberty the best grounding they could have, mere utility, prudence. And likewise, I think Steven Pinker is drawn to Hobbes, partly because, or largely because, Hobbes anticipates the worldview of the modern sociobiologist. Again, humans are mere matter driven by appetite and instinct. No theory of freedom, to Pinker, can make sense unless it acknowledges this basic set of facts, or what he believes to be facts. So the vogue for Hobbes might well reflect the new prominence of this kind of thinking: methodological materialism, atheism, a denial of the soul and of the free will. These are common views, perhaps not in the general population, but among our new priestly class of sociobiologists and new atheists. And to people of this disposition, it might not be particularly troubling to reduce religious freedom to conscience freedom, and to make any wider religious freedom merely a matter of the state's prudence. Increasingly in our divided culture, religious freedom is cast as a special set of exceptions for unruly religious citizens who might need to be placated lest they cause instability, but who have no inherent right to anything other than their private beliefs. It is to me striking and worrying how religious freedom has in recent years become understood as a sectarian or partisan cause for conservative Christians, Jews, and so forth. That's not how I understand it, and I think it's worrying that that's how it's increasingly understood in our public discourse, and there's probably blame on both sides for this. Religious freedom was originally sought by dissidents who rejected the enforced public ideologies of Christianity. Now religious freedom has become the cause of a beleaguered Christian counterculture. The dominant legal and political culture in some institutions, and I'm afraid I have to include universities in these institutions, is now secular, materialist, and atheistic, and to a certain extent morally relativistic. The only true freedom is interior and private. But this is, I would suggest, the mere freedom of the greengrocer. And I'll close with a story to illustrate this point. In Canada in recent years, we have had a large debate about assisted suicide. The Supreme Court there held in 2015 that laws preventing assisted suicide were a violation of the rights of consenting adults to end their own, quote, enduring and intolerable suffering. This was widely criticized as an overreach, as a decision not supported by the Canadian Charter. But there it is. The judges had spoken, and the law will be enforced. So there is now a right to assisted suicide in Canada. Those opposed to assisted suicide, defeated, have thus turned their attention to the question of the right of healthcare professionals to refuse participation in the regime of assisted suicide. Keeping in mind that until 2 years ago, the Canadian medical associations all forbade medical personnel from engaging in assisted suicide, and that this is still the position of the American College of Physicians, and for now, the American Medical Association. But the position of dissidents currently hangs by a thread in Canada, with the likelihood that doctors will be forced to at least refer patients for assisted suicides, and that hospitals, and this is probably the most problematic aspect, including Catholic hospitals, of which there are many in Canada, will be forced to provide assisted suicides. The question obviously entails conscious protections for other procedures, including abortions, which have traditionally been kept out of given conscience protections but are now being reevaluated. As I say, the signs are not particularly good, and I've followed the debate with some interest, and as I'm sure you can divine from the nature of my talk, some sympathy for the notion that conscience freedom should prevail or obtain in this instance for objectors. Objectors should have, I think, not just the right to their opinion, but the right to act upon their opinion. So you can perhaps imagine my consternation on reading the justifications of the denial of such protections that have been produced on a massive scale by medical ethicists, so-called. I'll close this lecture by describing one of these by a colleague of mine at Queen's, oddly enough, a man named Udo Schuklenk, who is a prominent ethicist and a journal editor in this field. In a piece appearing in no less an outlet than the prestigious British Journal of Medical Ethics, Schuklenk disavows all conscientious objection protections in medicine whatsoever in liberal societies. His logic is telling. Liberalism, in his view, protects the right to hold beliefs, to have opinions. and one could only live by them within reason. Sure, but what does within reason mean? That's the question. After complaining rather loudly that most cases of conscientious objection are brought by litigious religious believers, Shoeclank gets to the nub of it. In medicine, at least, the rationale restricting conscientious objection is purely the rationale of state power. The sovereign's understanding of the common good prevails. The sovereign's power to license and regulate according to its understanding of the common good prevails. And nonconformity, outward nonconformity, is illegitimate in all cases and in all procedures. And remarkably and tellingly, Shoeclank openly invokes Hobbes. Hobbes, he writes, knew that individual conscience was subjective, was opinion, and was usually erroneous. In the Commonwealth, Shoeclank writes, quoting Hobbes, the law is the public conscience by which subject hath already undertaken to be guided. Otherwise, in such diversity as there is of private consciences, which are but private opinions, the Commonwealth must needs be distracted, and no man dare to obey the sovereign farther than it shall seem good in his own eyes. Shoeclank is a utilitarian, an atheist. He openly describes religious beliefs and opinions as arbitrary and implausible, and he's confident that the cultural and intellectual winds are at his back, and he may be right. For those of us facing into those winds, it must be deeply worrying that a prominent bioethicist with large influence over public policy in Canada is satisfied with this Hobbesian understanding of religious freedom or conscience freedom. And Shoeclank is not alone. And I think I'll close on that potentially disquieting note.
Yeah.
So I have a question. What do you think Hobbes and Locke's views would be on the fact that people have the rights to their own opinions, however, that kind of gets funneled down into the general right after a while? So say like discrimination, how in their time that probably was acceptable, but now it's not.
Well, you're getting to the nub of our kind of current debates. I mean, obviously, their moral judgments about what's acceptable or not acceptable would have differed. And I'm not suggesting that every act of discrimination that they justified, I'm talking about their broader societies, would be justifiable. So there have to be limits to the right of association and the right of discrimination. Now, discrimination, we tend to think of that as the most evil thing in the world, but if you think about the use of the word, we discriminate when we make any kind of decision or judgment. So when I discriminate against Nazis coming into my inn, I'm discriminating, I'm making a discrimination, I'm discerning something. Obviously, there are cases where we think this is unacceptable, and I think according to our constitutional order, they have to be completely prohibited, as in the case of racial discrimination. But both the example of the Nazi and the example of racial discrimination stand alone. We can't analogize from them to describe every single case. That's, I guess, how I would answer this. And the danger, I think, of our current regime is that we tend to think of all of these questions being adjudicated by rights. We're obsessed with this notion. My rights, your rights, all we do in politics is adjudicate our rights, our private opinions. When actually what we're usually doing is talking about rights while we fight about moral questions. And we're afraid to fight about we're afraid to debate moral questions. And so we talk about rights because we're afraid of that. We're afraid of moral disagreement in a way. So I guess my concern about making a kind of general prohibition that we don't discriminate under any circumstances, none of us, is that we are effectively choking off moral and political debate by using a kind of shadow boxing technique of rights talk, equity, and jurisprudence. And this kind of shows the dominance of courts in our society. Whenever we have a disagreement, we go running to the courts. We've forgotten what Jefferson and Lincoln said, and that's basically this is oligarchy. And when Lincoln said it, he was talking about a court that had enshrined religious discrimination in the Constitution and partly wanted to shut up religious people who objected to religious discrimination because of their religious views. So we can turn these around and see, I think, from the other angle, how there's a danger in the judicializing and the rights orientation of a lot of our political debates. Yes?
Do you think that utilitarianism has any role in public decision-making or academia, I guess?
Well, it certainly has a role in academia. I hope you learn about utilitarianism. I mean, does it have any role? It has a role in the free exchange of ideas. And to the extent that people want to advocate for it, they should have the freedom to do that. And I think there are many able defenders of utilitarianism. And I do think, from my own perspective, that utilitarianism does have something to say for itself. As against Rawlsian or Kantian deontological thinking, kind of an abstract notion of morality, utilitarians are interested in the applied consequences of decisions, of ethical decisions. And I think we do have to pay attention to consequences when we make moral decisions. And that requires us, and this is a kind of an Aristotelian point of view, to think about practical, and think using practical reason, not just theoretical reason. Other questions?